I'm seeing we are at 7:30. I know some folks will still keep popping on, but I want to respect everybody's time boundary and go ahead and get us started. So I'm the Reverend Sarah Green. I'm pastor at the Wharton United Community Church. And it is my pleasure to welcome all of you on behalf of the Presbytery of the Highlands and the church development team, which is the committee that is bringing you this evening. And so I'd like to welcome the Reverend Rich Hong. He is the pastor at the First Presbyterian Church in Englewood, has been there since 2005. So yes, you've been in one place a really long time, Rich. Rich holds his Master of Divinity from Union Theological Seminary in New York. He did his undergraduate work at Princeton University, where he got his bachelor's degree in chemistry. So he is one of those people who uses both sides of his brain, I'd say, in a lot of different ways. Before he entered ministry, Rich ran his own software consultancy for 20 years and wrote computer programs for research scientists in the pharmaceutical industry. He's a Chicago native, but has lived in New Jersey since college. And he brings his tech background into his ministry and writes a regular column on the Digital Church for Presbyterians Today magazine. And I see him pop up in plenty of other publications doing the same. And Rich has a real passion for evangelism and mission and hopes his own church, which has been going through many different things since their building burned a number of years ago. Rich was just sharing some of that as others were popping on. But he is hoping that his church is going to be able to continue its growth as an inclusive, multicultural, and intergenerational community. And we look forward to hearing more from Rich. I'll give you the heads up that in the chat, he has dropped a link to his PowerPoint handouts. So anything and everything that he is putting up on the screens, if you want to be able to have that later, know that you can just go to that link and download it for yourself.
Can you see messages in the chat that were dropped before people joined? I forgot what the rules are on that on Zoom.
Nope.
Okay, let me drop it again.
There we go. I didn't
Yeah, I
realize.
see it. Yeah, I've got it.
Yeah, I remember I did that in some other meeting, and people who joined after I put it in the chat couldn't.
Oh,
Very good. All right.
Because I did that after you put it in.
Perfect. Well, then without further ado, I will pass the Zoom over to Rich.
Okay, if you see me looking up, it's because my monitors are stacked, and so the monitor that y'all on Zoom are up above me, so that's what happens if I'm seeing you. Also, what I'm able to do is, oh, when I'm spotlighted, I didn't, hold on.
Maybe pinning was the part.
There we go. Okay. So now you can see my slides there. Feel free to ask questions. I know that we're scheduled to be out in an hour, but I don't have a hard out if you have questions that would linger past the end of the time. You know, hopefully you get one idea out of this that does something for you. And, you know, we might not agree on things, and that's fantastic. And so, because I think a lot of trying to push for change is challenging presumptions. And when we do that, you know, there are going to be differing opinions on what's important and things of that nature. So it's fine if we bring different perspectives to things. Now, when we talk about change and the change that we've kind of managed to accomplish here over the last 2 decades, a lot of it is that, you know, change is hard. Nobody wants change. Okay, so we all know this. Nobody likes change. We prefer things to stay the same, and change is hard when you push change for the sake of change. I mean, ultimately, it's a matter of trying to create an environment where change becomes natural because people are interested in some other outcome, in some other result than what they've been experiencing. You know, it's kind of like with young people, right? When does a teenager suddenly take an interest in personal hygiene? You know, it's when they discover dating, okay? And then suddenly there's this new incentive, a new set of rules, a new set of things that they're interested in, and then at that point they're willing to change. And so a lot of what we've done is just tried to create an environment for change by focusing on a few different things. First of all, spending a lot of time prioritizing the needs of people we want to reach and understanding their lives. So that's one thing we're going to talk about. A second thing we're going to talk about is being very clear about owning our values and what they are, rather than running away from clear statements about what we believe in and who, you know, and who we're trying to reach. And then it becomes a matter of trying to develop a specific vision for what can be, so that we're not just throwing out theoretical ideas, but actually having some concrete vision for what we're doing. And finally, it's taking those steps to implement the vision, which is the hardest thing. One of the things I found in our archives here was the minutes of a session retreat from 1979, where from 1963 to 1979, this church had lost half its membership and 2/3 of its worship attendance. And they had a session retreat at Stony Point in 1979, and the minutes had been typed up and clearly mimeographed on construction paper. Okay, that's how far back this goes. And I find it in the archives. And the list of things that they said that they wanted to do in terms of a rough outline of the things that have to be done is completely identical to what the list would be if we did it today. All right. You know, slight changes in media, like they were talking about trying to maybe even do radio ads. Well, obviously you wouldn't be advertising on the radio today, but it was a list of things that all made perfect sense. They were all the same. And the only difference is actually implementing it. The difference is actually saying, okay, here are these 4 or 5 ideas that are on paper. Now, what do you do to actually turn them into something concrete? So the first thing, and I think it really is a hard thing for people to get to, is really understanding the needs of the people that we want to reach when you're in an environment where a lot of our congregations have become demographically distant from the congregations they're trying to reach. Okay, and so that's a problem, whether it's age distance or cultural distance or socioeconomic class, whatever it is. A lot of our congregations have become groups of people who are, you know, lovely people. They're not mean-spirited, or they don't bring anything negative to the table, but it's just that they're in their own bubble, and they're in a bubble that's different from the community around them. And when that happens, you're not necessarily going to understand what their lives or their needs are like. And when it comes to talking to people about meeting their needs, sometimes I think we get a little too concrete in some of these. For example, in Matthew 25, we talk about being Matthew 25 congregations, and it's really important. But my favorite part of Matthew 25 was, I was in prison and you visited me, because that reminds me that you don't necessarily have to solve the problem. I mean, where's the person after they visited? The person is still in prison. It's not like I was in prison and you brought me a cake with a file in it, and, you know, and we broke you out of prison. We didn't do that. At the end of the day, the problem was still there, but the importance was coming alongside the person in their time of need. So the importance is just coming alongside the person and saying, okay, I see you struggling. I see what you're going through. Let me come alongside you and just be with you in your troubles, as opposed to the tendency that we have to want to solve a problem, when a lot of people at a very fundamental level don't necessarily want us to solve the problem, but they do want to be seen. They want to know that we appreciate the struggles that they're having, that we can relate to them, and the ability to relate to them and their problems is important. And this is a quote that from, you know, I went to Union in New York, And I always loved the story of Bonhoeffer coming to America and then returning to Germany, okay, in the 30s. All right. And I love this quote. And this quote was actually very important to us during COVID when we were hunkering down at first. Of course, COVID begins and you hunker down and you're trying to survive. But this was a real impetus for us to get out into the community even during COVID and start doing some things. It was because Bonhoeffer wrote to Niebuhr. He goes back to Germany, and Reinhold Niebuhr, his fellow faculty member, is like, "What the heck are you doing?" And he writes to Niebuhr and says, "I have made the mistake in coming to America. But this great line is, I will have no right to participate in the reconstruction of Christian life in Germany after the war if I do not share the trials of this time with my people." All right. And so I think a lot of our connection to the community is making this decision that we are going to know what their trials are and share their trials with them. All right. So, for example, during COVID, we got very deeply involved in a charity that formed to distribute free groceries, because at the start of COVID, there were food wholesalers, right? Restaurants were shut down. They had tons of food that they couldn't get rid of. They were donating an insane amount of food. And a person locally who I happen to know started a charity that would receive these groceries and just pack them up for free distribution. And even during COVID, with masks on, we're that summer we're packing groceries in parking lots because we're to be outside and be a little safer. But we were doing that every single week because we felt like we would have to earn our right to minister to the community after COVID by being present with the community in their struggles during COVID. And that continues as a ministry to this day. That charity hasn't shut down. They're still going, and we have a crew there every single Tuesday morning packing groceries ever since. But this idea of sharing the trials of people is important. Another thing that's important, is just trying to do life together. It's hard to do life with people if you don't understand their lives. And this is about kind of getting personal with people and having relationships and having people be transparent. So a big part of our service every week is the prayer time, pastoral prayer time. And what we do with it is people text in their prayer requests, since a good portion of our folks are watching online, as well as in the space. It's, probably about, since COVID has receded, it's now down to maybe 25% of our Sunday is online, but it's still about that. And so people text in their prayer requests, and they come to an app that my deacons have access to. And so we have a system. What happens is every week the prayer requests come in. I read them during service. At the second service, I read all the ones that came in at the first service plus the ones that came in at the second service. We read them, we pray them, and then the deacons follow up with them. So on Monday, one of the deacons copies all of the prayer requests out of that app where these prayer requests came into, and then they send them out to the prayer chain, because we still have one of those, just like a lot of churches do. But then the moderator of the deacons farms out the prayer requests to individual deacons to respond to. So every single person who texts a prayer request into us that week will receive a response. It might be just an email. I mean, if we don't know who they are, like the phone numbers are mapped into our database, but if it's a phone number we don't know, they just get a text message back saying, "Hey, we're not sure who you are, but just want you to know we're thinking about you. We're continuing to pray the prayer request. And by the way, if you'd like to let us know who you are, that would be great." Or they may get an email, they may get a handwritten card in the mail, they may get flowers if it was a death, but the deacons will respond in some way. So they'll not just have the prayer request read during service and prayed for, there will be a one-on-one touch that happens by the end of the week when they've sent it in. And so that's just an important part of us telling people that we actually care about the stuff that's happening in your lives. And so the deacon it gets assigned to can do things that are great, takes a huge load off me, by the way. Somebody texts in a prayer request saying, oh, hey, I'm having, minor surgery same day. They're not staying overnight in the hospital, but they're going in for something on Wednesday. Then what happens is the deacon will follow up with them on Wednesday and say, hey, how'd it go? Did you get home yet? Do you need anything? And then if they hear back that there were complications and they had to stay in the hospital, something went wrong, then the deacon can let me know that that has happened. And then I can go visit in the hospital. But this is a system, a process that makes sure that everybody who texted in understands it. And probably 80% of our people have never texted in a prayer request, but they see it happening. And they even understand that, wow, they can somebody is sitting at home on their couch, even texting in a prayer request, and then it's coming out of my mouth, on the live stream. And so so it gets this sense of participation and involvement and personal touch, even when that's not there. Because a lot of success has to do with doing the small parts well. It's not the big parts. It's most of our churches are small, and one of the questions is whether we are able to execute small well, and execute the personal well, because it's still going to boil down to that. The largest churches in America, with thousands and thousands of people, organize their folks into small groups so that there's a feeling of personal connection within that large group. And so, we have a contemporary service, do a lot of praise music in that, all the classic big stuff. And there was a song that Elevation came out with a couple of years ago that I loved, because there's a lyric in there. If you listen to the live recording, it sums up how a lot of people feel. So you have this lyric talking about same God. So it's just a song about how God has been unchanged through history. All right. And so you have this lyric that goes, this is the second verse. It says, I'm calling on the God of Mary, whose favor rests upon the lowly. I'm calling on the God of David, who made a shepherd boy courageous. And then it says, I may not face Goliath, but I've got my own giants. And when you hear the live recording, you hear the people sing that louder than anything else. Okay. Because, that's how you relate the Bible to their lives. David beating Goliath means nothing unless you learn that it means you can beat the Goliath in your life. What's the Goliath that you're facing? What's the Goliath you're up against? And they need this picture that God is on their side. And so the question is, do you know their giants? Because for example, all right, I'm single, never had kids, but I can tell you from talking to parents and working with youth, if you raised your kids 20 years ago, you do not know what it's like to raise children today. Right? The parents we talk to of young kids today, oh my gosh, it's just a different world. All right. Their life is different and often contradictory, because you hear these wonderfully contradictory things, like they want authenticity, and yet you're dealing with social media personas. All right. That they want privacy, and yet they're sharing pictures of everything they do in their lives. All right. And so there's these contradictory stressors even that people are feeling. They want their kids to be able to play and just grow and explore, and then they schedule them into lessons and activities, just 24/7. Oh my gosh. I mean, but that's the way that's what they feel they need to do to be good parents. And what a parent today feels they need to do to be a good parent is different than what it was 20 years ago, certainly different than when I was a child. And a big part of our family ministries program is about trying to listen to that and support them in trying to be the parents they want to be. All right. But in order to do that, you have to know that. You just can't say to them, "Oh, why are you signing your kids up for so many things?" I never did that with my kids. All right. That will just label you and the church as irrelevant to their lives. And so and we have Sarah's
Hi, Nathan.
yeah. Yep.
Hi, Nathan.
Yeah. It's a different, he's growing up in a different world than what we had. Okay.
Yeah.
And then there's a question of what they want. And in terms of what they want, what I love this, I love the writings of a man named Donald Miller. He's actually become a business consultant. He's a Christian, but not a minister. And he writes under this rubric called Story Brand. All right. He developed this thing within the church and then built it out into a business consulting thing where he frames everything in life in terms of story. And what he says is that basically every person is writing a story with their lives, and they are the hero of that story. All right. And so that's his framework, is to say that every person is seeing themselves as the hero of the story that they're writing with their lives. And then he says that when you look at elements of story, a good story is based on a character who wants something important. By the way, the goal has to be meaningful. They want something important, and then they have to overcome conflict to get it. That if there's no conflict, there's no story. If the goal is not meaningful, there's no story. There has to be a meaningful goal and a conflict. And so if the person is the hero of the story, what Donald Miller says is that the strongest character in the story isn't actually the hero, it's the guide. In each of these stories, there becomes a person who comes alongside the person to help them overcome their conflict. And so, he gives simple examples. Luke Skywalker, all right, who's the guide? Obi-Wan in the first movie, and then Yoda, all right, okay. And or in the King's Speech, it's Lionel, all right. And so you have these people who come alongside the hero, and the hero is flawed, the hero is uncertain, the hero doesn't know that they're able to do what they want to do, and the guide comes along to teach them to do it and help them do it. And he said that what the problem with most churches is that they position themselves as heroes. And people aren't looking for heroes, they're looking for guides. Right? And that when a person comes to a website and the church is just about we're the hero, we're the hero, we're the hero, because we're doing good things. He said the person isn't against that. The person comes to the website and says, "Oh, that's wonderful. You're doing good things. You're doing heroic things. But I'm not looking for a hero. I'm looking for a guide. I'm looking for something that will help me unleash the hero within me." All right. And I think you even see parts of scripture, like when I first heard this from Donald Miller, and I start remembering Jesus saying, "You will do greater things than these." All right. And to me, that's Jesus telling the disciples, all right, you're going to do greater things. You're not just heroic because I'm here, but even when I'm gone, I will have guided you to be able to do greater things than you've done before. And so positioning our churches to be the guides to help people become heroes by overcoming the Goliaths in their lives is something that I think people are looking for. So people admire heroes, but they need a guide so they can be a hero. And this is one of the things that we can try to do. Now, jumping off that track onto a slightly different tangent for a moment. It's understanding how the world around us is so different, and understanding that when COVID happened, nothing changed. If you think COVID changed things, look at this from 2018. So pre-COVID, from business publications, here are some things that are interesting. In 2018, you can go Google with, time limits on the search. There were articles talking about how on LinkedIn and Monster and stuff like that, in 2018, the fourth most popular job search term was remote work or work from home. Okay. Labor analysts in 2018 were predicting that in 10 years, by 2028, 1/3 of workers would be remote 2 to 3 days a week. All right. In 2018, Zoom, Uber Eats, and Instacart had all basically doubled their revenue from the year before. And the largest churches in the US had reported online attendance higher than in person, that the number of views they had during the week were higher than in person in 2018. So when COVID hit, we would not have been able to create an infrastructure like Zoom or Uber Eats or Instacart in that time. We used it because the infrastructure was already there. And so those businesses just grew. All right. We had actually started online giving in 2014, and we started live streaming our worship in 2017 because it was already fairly clear that this was where the world was going. And so it's one of the things that really helped us during COVID was having looked at what's going on in the world and trying to stay ahead of that. And that's one of the things that we kind of need to do as churches. What's next in that regard? I don't know. I've been paying a lot of attention to things like virtual reality because I actually think that would be a really awesome way to do live streaming. I'm imagining a day when you've got VR viewership for live streaming. And so a person could actually decide while they're watching your service what they want to look at, as opposed to what the camera operator decides that they're going to look at. And so I'm seeing that as a really viable thing for the future, because if you were set up for VR, you actually don't need camera operators anymore. Because VR, you would just have fixed position cameras covering your entire worship space. And it's the VR software that decides what you're going to look at because you turn your head and you're looking at something different. So it would actually be simpler for churches to execute and create a better experience at home. So VR is actually one of the things that I'm looking at for what could be coming down the pike. Paid a lot of attention to TikTok. That's gone nowhere as far as the church world goes. We've not seen much inroads in that regard, but it is a reminder that technology is ubiquitous. And it's not about the technology. It's simply about the fact that the people we want to reach live in a culture that's immersed in and defined by technology. So that's just the water they swim in. And so, we just have to be familiar with it. And remembering that, like Jason Dorsey, he's an expert on generations, and he was talking about this. He said millennials, they're not tech savvy, they're tech dependent. And there's a huge difference. They're not actually, like, I worked on computers in the 80s. I can rip a computer apart, change all the circuit boards, solder stuff together. People can't do that today. Like my phone, I can't even change the battery. The phone is soldered in, right? I'd have to send it back to a manufacturer to get a battery changed. They won't let me do that. And that's because as technology becomes more ubiquitous, it actually becomes more opaque, and people don't actually understand it. They just expect it to work, but that's how much they live in it. Like my dad, is gone to be with the Lord. He could change the oil in a car. If you want to find someone who can change the oil in their car, find somebody who's like 70 years or older. Right? I mean, that's the reality. There isn't I haven't seen a 20-year-old, work on their car in ages. They'll take it to the car wash to get detailed, but they have no idea what they're doing because the technology's become very opaque. And that just is a sign of the extent to which they're dependent on it. It's not something that they see as something separate. It's something that they see as just a part of their lives. Another area, by the way, that's not technology, where I've seen the same thing with young people, it's on the subject of like interracial relationships. if you're my age, right, I'm about to be 64 years old. If you're my age, I grew up in an age where that was an uncommon thing, and you would notice it. All right. If you were to even mention today, even in an approving sense, if you talk to a teenager today, oh, how nice it is that like a white kid and a black kid can date and nobody cares, or nobody objects. They'll look at you like you have two heads. They're going to look at you like, what are you talking about? Why are you even noticing this? That's just the world they live in. That's not even a factor. Why would you talk about it? Why would you mention it? Okay. And we can seem out of touch even when we're being approving by calling out something that's so natural to them. The other thing is that most people, especially the younger you are, the more that likely it is that you've actually experienced community mediated through technology. All right. And so I remembered the experience that I had since I was involved with computers was 40 years ago. Not 40 years ago, I'm sorry, when I was 40 years old. So that's, 24 years ago, I was on this thing called CompuServe, if you remember that. And there were these tech forums and there were these people, we would talk every single day on there. But, we're talking about the time of dial-up modems and stuff like that. And what I remembered was this person who I'd communicated with, we'd exchanged messages on tech stuff for a couple years, every day, had questions. I did not know what he looked like. I had never seen a picture of him because pictures took too much bandwidth. So all I knew was his name. I knew he was married. I knew he worked for IBM, lived in Texas, had a couple kids. And I woke up to a message that he had been in a store that got robbed and was shot and killed in the robbery. And what I remembered was that I cried. And I had never met the person in real life. I could have walked past him on the street and not recognized him because I had never seen a picture of him. But I cried when I heard that he'd been killed. And that stuck with me because it all the way into all the talk about online church and everything, it stuck with me because it reminded me that I have an experience of feeling community with someone I'd never met. And I think this was even true. You go back however many years to pen pals. People experienced friendship and community through letters. So let's not discount the fact that they've done that. And the gaming community, oh my gosh, it's huge. And people feel deep connections to others through gaming. And if you think that that's just, basement dwelling teenagers, the average age of online gamers is 33 and 48% are female. Okay. So they're experiencing community mediated through technology. They're experiencing community just seeing people as avatars in a virtual world. All right. But it's real community to them. And so we kind of need to understand that what community looks like and feels like is different. Another thing that's happened in the world around us, and this is my argument for online worship, worship frequency, the decline that most of us have seen in average worship attendance is largely attributable to a decline in frequency. I mean, it's simple arithmetic. If people only come twice a week as opposed to every week, your average attendance drops in half, even though the size of your community hasn't changed at all. They're just coming less frequently. Like we had an elderly woman. She was just so wonderful, and she loved coming to church here. She loved both the contemporary and the traditional service. She came every single week, twice a week, because she came to both services until she went home to the Lord. Okay. Replacing her takes like 8 people statistically. She came to both services every single week. All right. It takes a lot of people to replace that. All right. In terms of the stats, we had to, that's just math. And so one of the things that we've noticed with online worship is that it actually is increasing the frequency with which people are staying in touch with our worship, because people who couldn't come pre-COVID didn't watch online. They just didn't come and they disconnected. And if they got busy for a month, they were disconnected for a month and almost felt like they were diving back in after. But with online, they're staying connected by watching the service. They're busy on Sunday, they watch it on Monday. They still hear things like the prayer requests, which is really important to them. So that when they come back, they feel like they understand what's been happening in people's lives. All right. So what are some of the changes in our thinking? Well, one thing is simple, that it used to be that the church did the good by having people come together and work collectively to do good in the world. And now we're thinking that the church comes alongside people to inspire, enable, and equip them to do good for the world. And so there are things we do together, but there's a lot that we do in terms of people being inspired, enabled, and equipped to go out and do good. And so we think that's important. Next part, which goes pretty fast, is clearly owning your values. We have leaned very heavily into our progressive stances. You need to be known in the community for what you're for, that you're for each person, that you are for your community, and you're for Jesus. I mean, it's a matter of not being equivocal about what you stand for. And so we've leaned very heavily into these things. We take very clear stands on moral issues. I'm not talking about politics per se in the good old-fashioned definition of politics, like we're not going to take a stand on what the top marginal tax rate should be. Okay, but when it comes to moral issues, we take very clear stands. We understand that you can belong and disagree at the same time, but that's not going to make us not stand for what we stand for. All right, so we're very, very clear. And so we're unequivocally LGBT affirming. Okay, so it's very clear on our website. It's we've leaned very heavily into this with rainbow signs, the whole thing. There's an entire page on our website that is that is dedicated to talking about people being able to find a church that has the worship style they like. It's aimed particularly at people who love contemporary worship but are stuck in a right-wing church offering it. All right, and we're sitting there saying, no, we can give you all the praise and worship you want, the contemporary service you want, and yet have it reflect your values. But we're leaning very heavily into this in this time that we're, you know, that of what we stand for. And so we're basically saying, and you can't label, you know, we're putting Bible front and center. And so don't sit there and say we're ignoring the Bible by being LGBTQ affirming. We're not. We're following the Bible. We're Bible centered. And we're inclusive and affirming, but we're going very, very heavily into this. The first, all of our single person restrooms are all gender. These are the signs in our church school area. All right. So we make it very clear as to what our values are. And for most of our parents, they're fine with that because that's what's going on in the schools. Their schools are teaching these same values. So we're actually in line with what their children are experiencing during the week, which is this thing, this same kind of values. Unequivocally for social justice, the first thing we did after COVID was participate in a Black Lives Matter protest in town. The protest that was there was actually, that was the first time I had seen congregants in person, because that was in June of 2020. I hadn't seen any of them in person in weeks, and it was at the Black Lives Matter protest in town. Okay. By the way, one gentleman there, participating in the protest, never judge a book by its cover or by other stereotypes. His job before his current job was he was a CIA station chief. Okay. All right. And all right. We have EV chargers in our parking lot. We're very concerned. You know, we installed 4 EV chargers this year in our parking lot. They're not profit centers. If you can contact me afterwards if you want to learn about all the incentives that are available that will deal with your upfront costs, because we were able to get approximately $20,000 in make-ready costs covered free of charge by the government. And so The trenching work to lay the electric in, the dropping of a new electrical service for it was all free. We just had to pay for the charging stations and we're on the ChargePoint network. But this is, we actually paid for this as part of our outreach budget because we become known on every map of charging stations, which every EV owner, has apps to tell them where EV charging stations are. Bergen County, which is where we are, has a really high percentage of EVs. And when you drive into our parking lot and you see 4 EV chargers, it's on brand. And so this is, again, a part of how do we communicate that we're living into our values. And that's one of them. Okay, so that it's very on brand when people come in and they see that. But at the same time, we're unequivocally evangelical in the old-fashioned sense of spreading the good news. That's the sign in our church school space that talks about what our mission is with kids. It's to, but you'll see the kind of values that I've talked about. We're focused on connecting kids to peers. It's that relationship thing. That our volunteers are partnering with parents, that we're trying to enable parents to be better parents. But then we talk about how we want each child to see God for who God is, help them to see themselves the way God sees them, and help them to love others the way God loves them so they can take Jesus back to their home and their schools and their neighborhoods. All right, we're unequivocally evangelical. And so we don't see a conflict between our desire to spread the good news and holding very firm on progressive values. So it used to be that you were worried not to offend people because you didn't want to give people a reason to leave the church. But our problem now is giving people a reason to come to church. And in order to give people a reason to come to church, you have to stand for something. You have to clearly stand for something to get people to come. So it's a very different situation than if you've got tons of people and you don't want to offend them so that they leave, as opposed to saying, hey, we've got to give you a reason to not watch Meet the Press on Sunday. We've got to give you a reason to not go play pickleball on Sunday. Okay, but to come here. Although in our case, you can do both. We just put 2 pickleball courts down in our gym. So then that's starting this weekend to get people in. All right, next. Any questions or anything going on? Point halfway through. All good or not good, one or the other. Okay. Third, specific vision. This is actually the hardest part because people are not necessarily very good at understanding, at seeing what's possible. And I think that that's at the heart of why we often have conflict when we discuss change. It's that the people we're discussing it with can't really see what it's going to look like. All right. And that's why they object. You tell them it's going to be different, and that scares them, and they can't see it. All right. And because most people are just not good at taking words or theories and turning it into something concrete. And Presbyterians, we love our theology, we love our theories, we love our words, and it comes out looking like this. Now, if I put this on a board, y equals x squared minus 2x minus 3, how many of you can see that curve? Okay. All right. But that's what I really feel, that this is what happens when we discuss theology with our folks and don't make it concrete and don't give them what it looks like. Is we talk theology and they see the formula and they don't dispute the formula. They just don't see what that's. Okay. But if I show them this, oh, okay, now I get it. Now I understand what you're talking about. Okay. And we need to take words and help them see what those words mean. All right. We need to help them see what it is. And so, like, how do you acquire this vision? Well, first thing is explore. And with online church, my gosh, you can watch a half dozen services a week. Okay. You can see what other churches are doing. Please go outside the PCUSA and see what folks are doing. See what's happening elsewhere. You don't have to like everything that they're doing. You just have to, you can learn about preaching from a preacher whose sermon you despise. and you can still learn something about how they preached, okay? You can look at specific areas. What are churches doing in children's ministry? What are they doing with a mission project? How they get involved with that? How did that work for them? Okay, and you can learn about these things because there are some churches who I find repugnant in their theology who are still doing some very good things in the world. All right, they're doing some amazing mission work in the world. And I wouldn't be a part of their church in a million years, but I'd love to see how they came upon that mission and start doing it, because there are certain core values that we all have in common. We all want to fight food insecurity. We all want to fight homelessness. We all want to fight, spousal abuse, all these kinds of things that you can get involved with. And when you contact them, most churches are really very helpful. They're very willing to share information. Okay, I've learned a lot just by calling churches that I saw were doing something interesting and saying, hey, I saw you're doing something really interesting. Can you tell me about it? Can you give me some time? I've never had them say no. And this involves some churches. I remember I was heading down to South Carolina about a decade ago, and there was a massive, massive, massive church. A hugely right-wing megachurch, multi-campus. Their pastor flamed out in a personal moral scandal a few years later. All the stereotypical things you would expect. But I really just wanted to learn about their AV setup. Okay. And so I called them and said, I'm a pastor of a church. We're about 200 in worship, and in that world, people ask me how big your church is, and they measure by worship attendance. And in that world, I tell them, oh, we're about 200 in worship, and they go, oh, I'm sorry. But they actually gave me an hour with their AV team in town and gave me a tour of everything that they do. I learned so much from them because they were very gracious, and they knew my stances on things were very upfront, but they didn't care. They understood that we were Christians. All right. And they were really incredibly helpful. And give your leaders opportunities to see. We encourage our officers to take field trips to other churches, generally not Presbyterian ones, because we want them to see something as different as possible, at least twice a year. We encourage our officers to go elsewhere. We encourage them to attend conferences from other traditions. This year, because we were reopening our new space and there was a lot happening, North Point, one of the largest churches in the country in Atlanta, as mega churches go, centrist, they're very dead center. Andy Stanley's the lead pastor. He was just featured in a big article on CNN about these evangelical parents of a gay child and wrestling with that. And North Point hosted a very controversial conference called Unconditional, which was for evangelical parents of gay children. All right, and he took a lot of heat for it. But we took 14 officers down to Atlanta to attend Drive, and it had really wonderful effects. And this is actually something that's a value in the evangelical world. Pastors rarely attend conferences alone in the evangelical world. They always take a team, because what they sit there and say, they say, if you just come yourself, the ideas will die with you. You need to bring your team with you. And what matters is that they see and experience what happened. The main value that our folks came away with was nothing concrete. What they came in terms of techniques, they came back and they realized that the standard for everything we do isn't to do it good enough, but to achieve wow. Because what people remember is wow. Good people expect good enough, but they remember wow. And so our folks came back, and that was actually what they came back with was they said, our goal needs to be how to elevate good enough to wow. And that was great. How do we cast vision? Well, when I first got to this church, I took advantage of something. Now, this won't work for everybody, but there are two things. Number one, I'm single. Number two, I have a manse that's huge and on church property. Number three, I love to cook. Okay. So first year, I had every committee over to the manse for dinner. All right. So a lot of it was getting rid of the business. I had every committee over to the manse for dinner and we just talked about what we might do. Then after that, for a few years, we replaced every other session meeting with a joint session deacon meeting and talked about nothing but vision and leadership. So we did that for a few years. We said, okay, there really isn't that much pressing session business that can't wait. And if there is, they can bring it up and only the elders who are present will vote. But instead, we're gonna watch a leadership video. We're gonna watch something that about our community. We're gonna discuss vision, but we're gonna talk about where we're going. And we're just gonna do that. So it was a matter of just trying to bring the leadership on board. And I'll tell you that in casting vision, this was something Andy Stanley once said, that was, there was a small luncheon that I ended up with, and he was there. By small, it was like 100 people, that he's talking to. And he talked about the way they break news out at their very large church. They don't ever announce anything to everyone all at once. And he said, that's a mistake. He said, it's a mistake to announce everything all at once because there will be too many questions. He said, what they do is they start by announcing it to a small group of people, an inner circle, and then they can talk to you and they can ask you questions and you can answer the questions until their questions are done and they now all understand. All right. Then you break the news to a slightly larger circle of people. And again, they can ask their questions and you can answer them. But now you've got your inner circle who's equipped to answer the questions. The questions won't be that different. Okay. And then you go to a larger circle and you keep going with as many circles as you need until you get to the whole congregation. All right. But the reason you do that is that if you just stand up there as the leader and announce something to the whole congregation and you haven't even included your inner core leadership in on it, they're all sitting there going, why are we doing this? And some of them are going to turn to an elder and go, why are we doing this? And the elder's going to go, I don't know, haven't heard, I didn't hear a thing about this. I have no idea what's going on. And what you're doing with each concentric circle is you're building advocates and you're addressing objections, coming up with answers to objections. And then occasionally I also learn when I bring the idea to the inner circle, how bad an idea it was, and it dies with the inner circle. Okay. All right. Okay. Because that also can be one of the outcomes. But the idea of not trying to blast it out to everyone at once, but to release vision in concentric circles is a really good way of spreading vision so that at each circle, you're winning over a new core of advocates who can be your advocates of that idea to the next circle.
As a congregation of 23,000 members. So, I mean, that's they have 8 locations.
He's got a lot of circles. We don't need quite that many. But a big thing is that our biggest change in thinking was simply saying that we used to build from our past as needed, that our past was our core and we would tweak it and build it and change on it as we needed. Now it's all a matter of everybody looks to what's coming down the pike in the future and we're trying to be ahead of the next curve. That's just our change in thinking, is how can we be ahead of the curve that's coming? And finally, what are the steps that you take to implement? This is actually not that hard. Where we started, areas of low emotional attachment, okay, which are not the most important thing. So a big piece of this is don't necessarily start with the most important thing. Start with the easy win is the best way to build credibility. So you don't necessarily start with the biggest, most important thing. Start with the low-hanging fruit, because you want to rack up a series of wins. Wins are emotionally satisfying. All right. Like we used to use Dave Ramsey's Financial Peace University. We won't anymore because he revealed himself during COVID to be an even bigger jerk than I ever imagined him to be. And he's so toxic as a personality, we can't use him, can't use his material. But he used to do something with the teaching people to pay off credit cards that understood this principle. Any financial person, a math person, will tell you that you should pay off the credit card with the highest interest rate first because you're paying more interest. Dave Ramsey said no. He said pay off the card with the lowest balance first, because the satisfaction of paying it off and ripping up the card is more important. That's what motivates you to keep going. So just start with an area of low emotional attachment. The first things we started to spruce up were the ugly rooms that nobody cared about. Don't spruce up the room that everyone cares about. Spruce up the ugly room that nobody cares about. But you know what happens as soon as you make the ugly room look really nice? Then they start to sit there and go, oh, wait a second. That room we don't care about looks really nice. We got to do something about the room we do care about. Okay. So we started with the low emotional attachment, and then that just was the low-hanging fruit, the easy win. People saw improvement, and it motivated them to want to improve things that were more important to them. Where if we had said, hey, let's redo this room, they would have said, are you kidding? No, we love that room the way it is. You have to make them not love the room the way it is, and the way you do that is by making another room look better than it. So the change doesn't necessarily start in the most important place. It starts in the place where you can win. And finally, a great question a person, I don't know who it was, but when I was first starting out in ministry, I heard a person ask me this question, and it has driven me ever since. When a visitor comes to your church, what do you hope they don't see? And if you can answer that honestly, you kind of know where you need to be fixing things. All right. Big piece of our stuff is every year, once or twice a year, we get a 20-yard dumpster in and we start decluttering. I've said that the greatest thing a presbytery could do, because dumpsters are only a few $100s. I've said every presbytery ought to pay to send a dumpster to every one of its churches, as long as the church promises to fill it. Okay, because who doesn't have a pile of broken tables, broken chairs, broken music stands, desks we don't want? And what we actually do, we're in a neighborhood, there's a very, very diverse demographic around where we are. So what we do is if something is broken, it goes in the dumpster. If something is not broken but usable, we leave it outside the dumpster. And it's kind of like New York City. So if it's usable, someone will steal it if they want it. And then we leave it outside the dumpster for a week. And if it hasn't been picked up in a week, then we put it inside the dumpster. All right. But once or twice a year, we get a dumpster. All right. Because it's really important to get fresh eyes looking at it. Andy Stanley has a great talk about this. He says that you need a person in your church who sees clutter and can point it out to you, because you don't see it anymore. I don't see it. My office is a complete mess. I don't see clutter. He said the way you know who the right person is, he says, if you think they're the right person, ask to have coffee with them and let them drive. And when you get in their car, if they need to move something so you can sit in their car, they're not your person. They're fine with clutter. All right. So we've got some people who are neat freaks, and they are our clutter patrol. And we tell them we've got a dumpster coming, line it up, send it out. The other thing we do a lot is we do a lot of debriefing. We debrief all of our events. And I love the questions. These questions actually came from our family ministries director. She asks people, she says, where did you see God in the event? What worked and why? What didn't work? How can we fix it? Those middle two questions I think are pretty obvious. And the fourth one is, what connections did you see happening? All right. And for example, we're very mindful of kids who are getting along with other kids. Our church draws from a lot of different towns, so a lot of kids don't go to the same schools. When we see two kids getting along, we try to get their parents connected, because that results in play dates. The other thing that our family ministries director does is we run a traditional VBS in terms of 5 days a week, half a day in the morning, which parents drop off, parents pick up. But then on Saturday, after VBS, we have a cookout for all the families that were at VBS. And the reason why we do that is so that the kids who will see their friends that they made during the week will be there with their parents, and their parents can meet the parents of their kids' friends, because we want to connect the families together. So it's just a few different themes that you see through what we're doing. We're open to change, open to seeing what's around us, trying to make connections between people, and then connect that to faith. And then change is a habit. Continual evaluation, it leads to the continual improvement. Changing too late, we think, is generally worse than changing too soon, because we can always change back. And the more often we change, people just get used to it. So they don't even notice that something is different, because we're just changing it all the time. And so small incremental change works really well. And if your people are not used to it, Craig Groeschel, one of the pastors of one of the largest churches in the country, they've got campuses in like 11 states. But I love what he says here. He says, don't say our people won't. Learn to say we haven't taught our people to. All right. As leaders, we kind of have to own the reluctance to change as not being, never blame your people. Good leaders don't blame their people. All right. All right. Leaders understand that a leader's job is to lead, and a failure of followership is a failure of leadership. And so he says, don't say our people won't. Say we haven't taught our people to. And that leads to a different question of how can we teach our people to do what they're reluctant to do. How do we deal with objections? They're natural. If everyone wanted change, it would have already happened. And so we were generally doing things they didn't feel they needed. We don't actually announce most changes. We just make them, because most people don't even notice. So why tell them? So leadership decides, and we just do it. And then because it's implemented before you tell them you're going to do it, if it's a good idea, they see the benefits and the objector's power is diluted. It's much easier to object to an idea that hasn't happened yet than object to something that they actually see. All right. And so the biggest change was, you used to change slowly, carefully, and comfortably, but now people expect organizations are going to be nimble and responsive. And especially when it comes to getting volunteers involved in things, if they don't see a nimble, responsive organization, they don't really want to serve. And so the expectations among younger folks are different. And then we have to change because we're losing the next generation. And I love this. I took this picture of a slide at a conference I went to. We can't make the mistake of sacrificing this generation on the altar of our preferences. And I think that happens in a lot of places. We can't do that. And just remember that everything that we're doing, churches, when we do it, we really are in the long haul. You know, the average company in the S&P 500 is 21 years old. Churches are multi-generational, so we always think to the next generation. One thing we talk about in terms of growth is that it's more important to grow down than broad. Because if we lose the next generation, the church is gone in a generation, no matter how widely it spreads. So we emphasize, if you have to choose, growing down is more important than growing broad. And then we just add one thing, make one change, and stop one thing whose time is past. Just stop, you know. If it's kind of like putting a DNR on your events. If you have to be supplying life support to keep the event alive, it's time to let it go. Right? And so all of our events basically come with a DNR order. So that's what I have. And I'm 5 minutes over, but if you have any questions, comments, anything, game, we can go back to the broad view. Anybody have anything, questions, ideas, discussion?
You could drop a question in the chat if that's more comfortable for you, or just unmute yourself and throw something out there.
You talked, Rich, about having the change happen. How often do you get together either with your church leadership, whether it be session deacons or vested interests, visionaries, and do the global envisioning and compare that to the short-term detail type changes? As you probably have time, you probably have occasions to do each of these, but how often do you do them?
Well, basically with session, it's always global discussion. That's all we basically do. We do very little. We set policy and talk about global direction. That's essentially what we do at session meetings. All operational details are farmed down to committees or task forces. Okay, so it took a long time to get that to happen. I would say I was here close to 8 years before I finally heard something at a session meeting that made my heart sing. It was somebody brought up an operational detail, and one of the elders said, "That is not a session level discussion." And I was like, yes, but it took like 8 years to get to the point where the session saw themselves as only being concerned with the global issues, the policy issues, as well as things that are institutional, like what our insurance limits need to be and stuff like that, that the session needs to deal with. But our session never gets bogged down in, let me put myself back onto a regular view of who I am. Our session never gets bogged down in a discussion of operational minutia. They don't discuss when an event should be. The session doesn't deal with calendaring and stuff like that. That gets handled at a staff and committee level. Essentially, committees decide what events they're going to do, and then they check with the office to see if the calendar is clear. So basically at session every month, we're talking about global things. Now, in the past couple of years, we've been so consumed with construction that all the discussions really have been, so much about, when you're building a brand new worship space, that consumes so many of our decisions and discussions. But that's kind of what we do is we farm everything down to be as low, we follow the principle that a lot of organizations have, which is make decisions at the lowest level possible.
Rich, how might you, do you have a suggestion of how to adapt what you just said in a context where the church session is essentially functioning as a committee of the whole? Because the membership is so small that the extensive committee structure is no longer there and can no longer be there. And so you're getting kind of the mashup of operational details and vision just by necessity kind of needing to be done by the same group of people. How, do you just have any ideas of how to deal within that reality?
Yeah, that's actually a really that's a really hard one. And the only analogy that I've seen to doing that, and it sounds very un-Presbyterian to say this, but if you look at like startup organizations that are very small, okay, and they're growing, what actually kind of happens is they start just allowing the individual, and this is going to scare Presbyterians, to be autonomous in their decision making and to not have to bring it back to the group. And so essentially, if you have an elder, let's say you have a small session, let's say it's 6 people or whatever, and they're basically each a program area unto themselves, kind of giving them the autonomy to make the decision without consulting the other elders, and just bring a decision in and teach the elders not to second guess that person. Like they can report it, but you teach them not to second guess it. All right. Starts to lay the structure for building downward, because eventually that person's going to need help. And then when the person needs help, sit there and say, no, your help doesn't come from this table. Your help comes from beneath. Your help comes from the people. But it just breaking the committee of the whole thing, the only direction you can break it into is to actually silo the people, which is anti-Presbyterian, but it's what generally happens in small organizations that are growing large is the operational areas. You have a person, they are the marketing person, and then you have the salesperson, you have the, tech, development person, and then they eventually grow organizations underneath them, but they're not checking in with one another. Now, one of the things that I did early on with the group as a session, and this is something you could do anywhere that starts to help them not micromanage, is I put in a very simple rule in debate. No negative questions are allowed until all the positives have been dealt with. So if someone puts forth an idea, there's a very simple rule. You must, the only discussion that's allowed at first is discussion on how to implement the idea or make it better. All right. It's very similar. I got the idea actually from Robert's Rules, from going to GA. Here's where I got the idea. I got the idea at GA. I was commissioner as an elder before I went to seminary at GA in 2000. And I learned this rule at GA, which was that you have to perfect a motion before you consider a substitute motion. All right. You can't consider the substitute before you perfect the main. And I'm like, that's a great rule for our debate. All right. You've got to perfect the idea before you shoot at it. So no one's allowed to take shots at an idea until it's been perfected. All right. So it's a really simple rule. You can have your shot. Don't worry. You're not telling people you can't voice a negative or you can't object, but sit there and say, how can you make it better? And that has helped certain things where, for example, you have a person who comes with an idea and the first thing person goes, how much is this going to cost? All right. I disallow the question. So they're saying, okay, how can we make this better? And then we'll worry about whether it can cost. And actually, I've had a couple of instances, not many, but a couple of instances where the session got more excited, even though the idea got more expensive. Because as it got more expensive, it became more attractive. And then the session was like, oh, I'm not willing to pay a little bit of money for something bad. It's kind of like eating. Would you rather spend more money at a better restaurant? Or you might not want to go to fast food. You'd sit there and say, I'd rather stay home and cook than go fast food, but I'll spend a little more money at a nicer restaurant. So perfect the idea. And then that sort of gets them out of the micromanaging thing. Well, it gets most of them out of it. You'll always have one or two on session who persist in being negative micromanagers forever. Okay, I think there's some kind of rule in churches that you must have equal representation means having a Debbie Downer on your session. Yeah. Or else you haven't gotten broad representation. But that was one of the rules that we put in. Okay, it was to do that. But it's pretty much by trying to break the habit of one person sticking their toe into someone else's operational area. We just had to break that apart. Other questions?
Okay.
My name is Don Carney from FPC Booton, and I was wondering to what extent in your elders and deacons and in and among the congregation does prayer and what kind of prayer participate in what you do?
Well, for us, the prayer, they're really into the praying for one another and with one another. That's a really important part of it. If you're talking about prayer in terms of discernment, I wouldn't, I think that they spend a little less time praying in terms of discerning like what we should do as opposed to the values we would have. I think the prayer lives of people is really what got us moving in the direction of standing firmly on our values. All right. So I don't think people are necessarily engaging in prayer for direction in a practical sense, but they are engaging in prayer for direction in terms of our values, praying for what we stand for, praying for what we want to communicate to our kids. And then they're very involved in praying for one another's needs and concerns. So I think those are the two areas where prayer is really important and personal devotions are really important. Anything else?
Hey, Rich, this is Bam Buchanan. I'm an elder with Hilltop Church in Mendham,
Okay.
and really appreciate your talk, by the way. This is so topical for us at Hilltop. I may want to have a follow-up conversation with you.
Hey, I would love it.
Okay, because this summer we actually did a survey. It was really an inter-church survey, but we kind of initiated it. We certainly initiated it. We led it, and had got community feedback about how do we get people back in the pews and how do we better service the community. And there were some interesting results from that. And again, maybe we talk about it offline. But one of the challenges at our church is reaching younger families and getting them back into church. You've listed a number of great things here. Sounds like your DNA is pretty strong. If you were to point to 2-3 key things that you think are really important to reaching younger families and bringing them in the doors, what do you think it would be?
Oh, great question. I could spend an hour on this question.
Yeah.
It took us a long time to get there. When I got here, we were really low in numbers. I think our average church school attendance was 4 20 years ago. Okay. And now we've got some it's really vibrant. We have a great family ministries director. That always helps. Great. She's amazing. But I would say there are a few things. Number one, the biggest problem that churches have, and I think you've all experienced this if you're in a smaller church, is critical mass, right? So critical mass is the biggest problem that you have. It's very difficult to build a children's program unless you have enough kids. And how do you get enough kids if you don't have kids, right? So that's a huge problem. So the number, I would say there are 3 things that are our focus. Number one, target specific age ranges of kids very narrowly, not kids in general, because having 6 first graders is the start of a program. 1 first grader, 1 second grader, 1 third grader, 1 fourth grader, 1 fifth grader, 1 sixth grader is going to collapse. We did our targeting very young because those kids aren't going anywhere. So how did we do that? First of all, every year we do 2 big things: a big Halloween costume thing in our parking lot, free to the public, and a big Easter egg hunt. Now, I'll tell you, with Halloween past, but with the Easter egg hunt coming, here, our family ministries director came up with a great way of doing the Easter egg hunt. It's brilliant. Love to have you connect with her. It's a scavenger hunt. It is not a trample the other children to get the most eggs hunt. So we've got like a dozen different cards, and they have colors of cards and a number of eggs. So a card might have 3 orange, 2 yellow, 1 purple, 3 green, and it makes a dozen, and there's a dozen different versions of the card. Each kid gets one. The eggs are distributed. They're empty. There's nothing in the eggs. They have to go find the right colors and get a complete set. And when they get a complete set, they cash the complete set in at a candy buffet. Okay, to pick the candy that they want. All right. Last year, we had like 200 kids at this. All right. And we advertise it because as a not, we make a big deal of the fact that it is a non-trampling Easter egg hunt, that it's an egalitarian Easter egg hunt, and the kids actually cooperate. Some of the beautiful things you see is a kid saying, hey, I need a purple, and another kid saying, I've got an extra purple, and they're trading. Or I saw a parent of like a 3-year-old sitting down with the kid and teaching them the names of colors using the card. Okay, so it's a non-competitive Easter egg hunt, but Easter egg hunts only attract younger children, especially if there's no candy in the eggs, and the bigger ones are the ones who want to trample other children. The 4-year-olds don't, and the parents of 4-year-olds don't want their children trampled. So we advertise that, we get them there. Now, does that bring people to church? No. And I'll tell it's free and it doesn't bring them to church, but we don't care, because this is the crux of a whole nother talk that I've done, which is this. The people who come to the Easter egg hunt, even if they're not members of the church, they're not going to attend our church, because here are the factors. Number one, they know we exist, or else they wouldn't have known the egg hunt was happening. They like us at some level, they think positively of us, or else they wouldn't have brought their kid to our event, right? They're not going to bring their kid to an event at a church that they think is an awful place. So they know us and they like us, and that's why they came to the Easter egg hunt. So why won't they come to church? Because they don't need a church. They already know about us. They already know we exist. They already have a mildly favorable opinion of us. So why aren't they coming to church? Because they don't feel they need a church. So what's the value of having them have a great time with their kid and saying, we're going to come back next year, we're coming to your pumpkin thing, your Halloween thing? It's because what we've created with those kids, all their parents have become ambassadors for our church. And they go out and they tell their friends where they took their kid for an Easter egg hunt. They tell their friends who don't know we exist about us. And maybe some of those friends are looking for a church. So our whole marketing is the slow burn. That's why I talk about how multi-generational churches are. Our churches are decades or hundreds of years old even. It's a long play. We're not direct response marketing does not work for churches because too few people are out there looking for a church. Okay. But brand reputation marketing is what works, and that is the long play. And every time we reach out into the community, we don't sit there and say, are we attracting someone to come to church on Sunday? That's not our goal. Our goal is, are we turning them into an ambassador for our church? Are we turning them into someone who will say nice things about us to other people? And then eventually somebody shows up in church and you go, how'd you hear about us? And they go, I don't know. I just heard y'all were a nice church. I heard y'all were doing good things. Okay. And that's a multi-year play, but it works. And number two, I guess that's number two. Number one is target a narrow age range so you get critical mass. Number two is you create ambassadors for your church in that area. Number three, don't forget to focus on programs to help parents become better parents, because parents want to be better parents. So doing programming for parents. Now, one of the things we do that came out of COVID was, after COVID, a lot of our parents were saying they lost their babysitters. That's a critical resource and stuff like that. So once a month, we have what's called Parent Night Out. Third Saturday of the month, drop your kid off at 4:00. We will feed them, show them a movie, play games with them, pick your kid up at 8. Meanwhile, the parents, you can go have dinner, go have a date night, and we are babysitting your kids. We have gotten at least a half a dozen new families in the church whose entry point was dropping their kids off for Parent Night Out. We don't charge. We pay for the pizza, we pay for the snacks, and we show a movie on a TV and they play games. Or we also do a craft with them or something like that. Okay. But that Parent Night Out really attracts people. And we limit it to 3rd grade and younger, because for the youngest kids. We have teen night for older kids, but we're like 3rd grade and under, and we get them. We've had anywhere from 6 to 22 kids dropped off at that. And like I said, it's been the entry point for about half a dozen families, because a parent comes, said, oh, I'm having dinner with my husband. We're going to dinner, or having dinner with my spouse, whatever. And we're dropping our kids off at the church. Oh, you can do that. Yeah, and you're welcome to. And then they come, they sign a release form, and their kids are there. And then they eventually have started coming to worship after about like 6 months of dropping their kids off for parent night out. But that was the main thing. And we ended up at the end of this, after a few years, we have this really large bolus of young kids moving through the system, where we had nothing. Like a few years ago, we did not have a senior high youth group. We did not have a middle school youth group. Now we have a middle school youth group, and we're starting a teen group, because those kids are starting to age up through the system. And the metaphor that I've used with our leaders is we are laying track ahead of a moving train. But we started young, and another value of focusing young, families hate to move when when a family has kids, they are typically picking the place they are going to live until their kids go to college, right? Unless they have to move. They don't want to move. So you attract those 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds into your church. You get a little group of them together, and they become connected. They will be at your church for the next decade. So we target the focus on young kids, and also young kids are easier to corral because they have nothing better to do. Right. Okay. They haven't hit traveling soccer yet or anything like that. You've got to get them tied in with their friends before all that other stuff comes into play. So we are very intentional about focusing our public facing family events at younger kids.
Thank you for that. You've given me some good food for thought, for sure. Appreciate it.
Great. Thanks. Any other questions?
Not so much a question, but a follow-up. I'm Richard Green. I'm an elder with the Beamerville Presbyterian Church up in Sussex, New Jersey. I think Van hit a target point that we're looking at with our church, because our attendance is very small. We're here since 1834, so we talk about roots.
Right.
I've got families that are still part of the founding families here.
Wow.
But it's getting the young people in that's a challenge. And I think it's a challenge that I think Sarah alluded to as well. When you're a small group of dedicated people trying to keep a church alive and grow it, that last discussion you had about bringing young people in is very insightful. And I think that you could probably develop an entire program around it that would be helpful. Because I have now, we finally got our Sunday school back again. We've got some young families that have come from other denominational churches in the area, because we're a Presbyterian church with this real super community feel. And I think people like that. But we also have this entrenched feeling of, well, this is the way we've done it for generations, and I don't want to change. That's hard to overcome when you have people that are very, very dedicated, but very stubborn.
Yeah, there's nothing you can do.
Laughing. That's what I said.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard so many pastors of very large churches and stuff, and they would lament that they would encounter that. They said, they would say, we just don't understand people who are more wedded to church as they understand church to be than they are sorrowful that their grandchildren aren't going to church. Yeah. And I don't exactly know how you trigger that in people, but I think in a lot of churches, people they need to get in touch with the sorrow that their grandchildren are unchurched, because we have so many of that. When we switched curricula here to a more evangelical children's curriculum, because it was more video based and stuff. And I remember about 12 years ago, we talked about at a congregational meeting that we had made the shift. And one of our oldest members, who literally she was a third generation descendant of one of our charter members in 1860. And at this point she was in her 80s. And she stood up and she goes, I am so glad to hear that you're changing the curriculum, because I raised all of my children in this church and not a single one goes to church now. You know? And so at least she recognized that we had failed her children. We had failed her children. And I think, you know, that's a tough pill to swallow for people, but I think they need to confront the fact that if they raised their children in the church and then as adults they stopped going to church, we failed. And by the way, a piece of that informs the way we do kids ministry here. We are so much more focused on good memories and fun than anything else. Yes, we want them to know that Jesus loves them. We want them to know certain basics. But what we want more than anything is for children to leave church having had a good time. There's nothing that moves us more than a child who tells the parents, I want to go back. Okay. Oh, and on that note, I can give you the simplest idea, if you aren't doing it already, that is phenomenal for bringing our kids here. You all have coffee hour, right? You all have hot water for tea, right? Do you have hot chocolate packets? Put out Swiss Miss with the hot water. The kids will love it. Okay. We have kids in our church. I swear, this is a true statement. I am not making this up. One of our parents who moved about a half an hour away from church, so it's now a much longer drive for them to get here. They get here, there must be hot chocolate. Her 2 children insist on hot chocolate when they come to church, but that's why they come. And they claim that that the church hot chocolate tastes better than when she makes it for them at home. It's Costco Swiss Miss, but her kids insist that church hot chocolate tastes better than home hot chocolate. But, you know, if that's a memory that gets that kid to bring their kid to church in 20 years from now when they've got kids, that's what we're trying to do. We want the kids to remember, hey, what we really want is for the kid to grow up. We tell parents this all the time. We want the kid to grow up and say, I remember that church. I had fun. I felt safe. I felt loved. I felt respected. That's what we want for the kids. I'm not as concerned about whether they're being raised as Calvinists or Arminians or, you know, or whether they're going to be subject to the lure of panentheism or something. No, hot chocolate, the theology of hot chocolate. It's really good for bringing kids.
Well, I am seeing the time at 9 o'clock, and this is a conversation that we could stay here all night and really have scratched the surface, both of Rich's enthusiasm and the depth of the subject matter. So I will just go ahead and close us for tonight, but know that this is a good group to be reaching out to each other, and it sounds like Rich is more than willing to be an ongoing resource and conversation
I would
partner.
love it. Any of you who want to reach out to me, I would love it. Besides, I saw a half a dozen people on there that I need to have lunch with already, who I know from another life. So I would love to do that. Any way we can, any way I can help, any way we can help. Would love to do so, because I'm really passionate about believing that churches can grow, not for the sake of growth, but it's because I believe people need a relationship with Christ. They need to know a God who loves them and is for them and cares about them.
Amen. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight. May the peace, love, and grace of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ be with each one of you as you go out from this virtual space tonight, and blessings on each of you. in all of the ways that you are growing in your faith and your service to the Lord and to Jesus' church. Have a good night, everybody.
Thanks for having me. It was a great, I had a great
Yes.
time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rich.
Good night.
Good night.
Night all.
Okay.
That's him.
All right. Well, Sarah, thanks.